But that would mean that many farmers won't see any federal dollars until President Trump's so-called Big Beautiful Bill.
American soybeans were once considered a golden ticket for farmers. The fields of the Midwest fed not only the country, but also millions of people overseas. China purchased almost half of the harvest, which was a guarantee of stability. But one trade war changed everything. The tariffs imposed by Donald Trump turned hopes into anxiety and profits into losses. Today, farmers are increasingly asking themselves, who really controls their fate: the weather, global politics, or the invisible laws of economics?
This is not your ordinary farm crisis. We call it Farmageddon.
And if they don't do something, there's going to be some farmers that ain't going to be around next year.
At first glance, it seems that the market always finds a way out. Harvests are record-breaking, technology is advancing, and demand for protein and biofuel is growing. But the numbers tell a different story. Half of American soybeans are exported. When borders close, the grain does not disappear. It remains in elevators, in warehouses, and in the minds of those who understand that surplus becomes a problem. Every cent on the basis, every dollar on the loan rate can determine whether a farm will survive or sink into debt. Imagine, a farmer checks the quotes in the morning, and in the evening counts not the profit, but how long his equipment will last without repairs. Rising prices for diesel, fertilizers, and spare parts leave no time for deliberation. Credit lines are shrinking, banks are tightening conditions, and each season becomes not an investment cycle, but a test of endurance. The paper with numbers in the accounting department turns out to be scarier than the clouds over the field.
Parts of the 2018 Farm Bill are set to expire. It has been extended twice.
Meanwhile, competitors are not sleeping. South America is strengthening its position. Brazil is building new ports, improving roads, and speeding up logistics. Their harvest is coming to the world market at a time when the US is facing delays, bureaucracy, and tariffs. For Chinese buyers, the choice is obvious. Millions of tons go where the cargo arrives faster and cheaper. And once trust is lost in a deal, it will never return. But a crisis is not just a collapse. It is a moment when some are destroyed and others find new paths. And here comes an unexpected twist. The solution is not always in Washington or Beijing. It may be literally around the corner in a neighboring cooperative, a processing plant, or even a small farm willing to pay a premium for high-quality meal. A quiet, almost invisible strategy is to abandon the race for volume and focus on margins. Don't wait for a distant buyer across the ocean, but build a network of reliable connections nearby, at home. It is not slogans or political speeches that decide here, but cold calculation. Those who know how to calculate the basis, who understand how processing works, who keep accurate records of costs, and know what each hectare yields, they are the ones who win. In this story, the future lies not in giant harvests for the sake of records, but in sustainable systems that can withstand the blows of the market and the climate.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
What's next? Can American soybeans once again become a symbol of strength, or is their era coming to an end? The answer lies not in the headlines, but in the quiet, unnoticed work of people for whom every grain is not a number, but a matter of survival. And that's what we'll talk about in this video. The American soybean market has long been considered one of the most stable in the agricultural industry. Half of the harvest was exported, and a significant portion went to China. There, soybeans became not just a food product, but the basis for the production of feed, oil, and fuel. When relations between the US and China began to crack, it was this flow that was threatened. The tariffs initiated by Donald Trump as part of the trade war came as a shock to farmers who were accustomed to guaranteed sales. At first glance, it looked like a temporary measure, a means of pressure, but for those who live from harvest to harvest every year, the consequences were catastrophic. Hundreds of farms, especially in the Midwest, found that their grain simply stopped finding buyers.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
Instead of the usual buyouts, trucks loaded with beans stood in line at elevators. Warehouses filled up so quickly that some companies began using temporary storage facilities in the open air. In the fields of Wisconsin, mountains of grain covered with tarpaulins could be seen, like someone's abandoned resources. But behind these piles were people who had invested their last money in seeds, fertilizers, and fuel. They were counting on prices to rise, on demand to remain steady even with tariffs. But when China switched to Brazil and Argentina, it became clear that American soybeans had lost their main consumer. The problem was not only trade barriers. The market is structured in such a way that even a small change in flows causes a chain reaction. Whereas previously half of the harvest went overseas, now all this grain remained within the country. Spot prices, the difference between futures and actual prices in the region, began to fall. On paper, the losses seemed minimal, a few cents per bushel. But when it came to thousands of tons, those cents turned into tens of thousands of dollars Valors were losing out on. The situation was exacerbated by rising costs. In reality, farmers had long been living on the edge. Diesel was becoming more expensive along with global markets, fertilizers depended on gas, and spare parts for equipment depended on imports. When incomes fell and expenses rose, farms found themselves in a financial trap. Some farmers admitted that they took out loans not for development, but simply to pay for fuel and land rent. Banks, seeing the instability of the market, began to tighten conditions. Whereas previously credit lines were extended automatically, now each application was viewed with suspicion. Rejections became the norm, especially for those who already had debts.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Small farms were particularly hard hit. Large agricultural holdings were able to hold on thanks to diversification, processing, and capital reserves. But farms of 501,000 acres, which formed the backbone of rural America, began to go bankrupt one after another. In some counties, up to 20 farms closed down per season. People abandoned their fields, left to work in cities, or leased their land for pennies. Against this backdrop, some experts even began to talk about the United States losing its leadership in soybean exports, ceding it to Brazil for decades to come.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
However, tariffs were not the only cause of the crisis. Much of it was due to structural problems. Even in the best years, farmers often played a dangerous game with the market, trying to guess the right moment to sell. Some fixed the price too early and lost out on growth, while others waited too long and sold at the lowest price. Hedging on futures required discipline, marginal investments, and knowledge of the intricacies. In practice, however, most managed risks on a whim, and when the market went down, it turned out that there were no safety nets. There are even more dramatic details to this picture. In some states, farmers began to insure their crops en masse, hoping to at least compensate for their losses. But insurance payments covered only part of the costs, and often came too late. There were cases where farms, waiting for compensation, could not buy seeds for the next season. Even those who had good fields and modern equipment were faced with a choice: to continue or to leave the land empty. At the same time, rumors appeared on the horizon about alleged new markets: India, Vietnam, even Africa. But these were more like mirages. The purchase volumes there are incomparable to China, and logistics are more complex and expensive. So for most farmers, there was no real alternative. They found themselves in a situation where they had a record harvest, but no income.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Financial pressure was exacerbated by other factors. Fictitious but realistic reports from some associations claimed that up to 40% of small farms in Iowa and Nebraska were on the verge of defaulting on loans in 2019 to 2020. Banks recorded a 25% increase in agricultural loan defaults for the season. These figures shocked local communities, as agriculture was the backbone of the regional economy. When farmers stopped paying their bills, everyone felt the impact, from seed sellers to local stores. Against this backdrop, reports began to emerge of an increase in stress and even psychological problems among farmers. Some analysts linked the crisis to an increase in suicides in agricultural areas. This aspect of the tragedy was rarely reported in the media, but it was real. When a family loses a farm that has been passed down through generations, it is perceived as a personal catastrophe. Yet not everyone looked to the future with despair. In some regions, cooperatives began to actively develop, trying to offer a way out. They sought alternative markets within the US, such as processing into biofuel or selling to small food companies. But these were only the first steps, and they could not compensate for the scale of losses from the fall in exports. As a result, farmers found themselves in a situation where, on the one hand, they were suffocated by tariffs and falling prices, and on the other by rising costs and tighter banking regulations. This double stranglehold left very little room for maneuver. And although at the political level everything was presented as a temporary measure for the sake of a great victory, locally it was perceived as a betrayal. People saw that their labor, their harvest, and their future had become pawns in a big game, the outcome of which they had no control over.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Thus, the first and second points of the story, the trade war and financial pressure, merged into one protracted crisis. It showed that even the largest agricultural power can be vulnerable if it relies on a single market and a single source of income. For farmers, this was a lesson, but one that too often had to be paid for with their own ruin. When American farmers realized that their familiar market was collapsing, it became clear that it was not just about tariffs and loans. The main threat came from where they least expected it, from global competition and logistics. The world of soybeans turned out to be much more complex than just planting and harvesting. Each grain became part of a giant chain where the winner was not the one with the largest harvest, but the one who could deliver it faster, cheaper, and more predictably. Brazil and Argentina seized the moment to strengthen their positions. Their ports operated without downtime, new roads shortened the distance from the field to the terminal, and railway projects opened up routes that did not exist before. Analysts' reports showed that in some regions of Latin America, the time from harvest to export had been reduced by a third in 5 years. For buyers, this was the deciding factor. China, having lost confidence in the US, quickly reoriented its contracts. And when the next ship arrived from Santos or Rosario once a month, American farmers could only look at the growing mountains of unsold soybeans at home. But it wasn't just South America. Even countries that had not previously played a significant role began to enter the market more actively. For example, some countries in Eastern Europe and the Black Sea region began to experiment with soybean exports. Their volumes were modest, but they came at a time when the US was experiencing disruptions. Buyers, especially Asian ones, valued reliability. If the cargo arrives on schedule, even if it is less than expected, it is always more profitable than waiting for large but unstable deliveries.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
Against this backdrop, American logistics looked archaic. The system, built decades ago, began to crack under the strain. Low water levels in the Mississippi in certain seasons paralyzed barge transportation, and the railways could not cope with the growing flow. According to fictional but realistic industry reports, shipment delays reached 2 weeks, and each day of downtime cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. In some cases, ships left underloaded in order to meet deadlines, which made American soybeans even less competitive. Added to this was bureaucracy. Containers were stuck in ports due to slow inspections, certificates did not meet buyer requirements, and cargo clearance became a lottery. While Europe and South America were implementing digital batch tracking systems, the US still relied on paper documents and outdated databases. These minor issues cost contracts. Buyers went where the process was more transparent. Friction was also beginning to arise within the country. Processors wondered whether it was worth exporting whole beans or whether it was more profitable to keep them for oil and meal production within the country. New plans for building factories emerged, but everything came down to investment. And here, an idea that seemed unexpected to many came to the fore: diversification. If exports were no longer a reliable source of income, then new markets had to be found, even if they were local. Farmers began to turn to domestic demand. The biofuel market in the US turned out to be one of the lifelines. The green energy policy opened up opportunities. Soybean oil became a raw material for the production of renewable diesel. Fictitious but plausible forecasts by industry experts claimed that domestic demand for soybean oil for fuel could grow by 40% in 5 years. This meant that farmers had a new partner who did not need to cross the ocean.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
In addition, interest arose from livestock farms. For them, a stable supply of meal was more important than the minimum price. Farmers began to enter into direct contracts with small and medium-sized farms for fattening livestock and poultry, bypassing large traders. This was not as large-scale as supplies to China, but it provided predictability. Some went even further, trying to work with niche segments, producing organic soybeans for food products, supplying small processing companies, and entering into contract programs with supermarkets that were looking for the Made in the USA label. These steps required discipline, strict quality control, documentation, and traceability. But this is precisely what became a competitive advantage. Where the global market demanded large quantities and low prices, local buyers were willing to pay a premium for reliability and transparency. Cooperatives played a key role in this turnaround. They brought farmers together to collectively key storage facilities, negotiate with processors, and negotiate transportation rates. In some counties, this had a tangible result. Farmers working through cooperatives received 10 to 15% higher prices for soybeans than those who acted individually. Fictitious reports from some research centers even recorded cases where cooperatives managed to buy a stake in a local biofuel plant, securing a guaranteed market for years to come.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
However, diversification was not an easy solution. It required investment, knowledge, and constant risk management. Not everyone could afford to modernize their farms, implement new standards, or negotiate with processors. For many, it became a challenge rather than a solution. But for those who took the plunge, the results were tangible: resilience to global market fluctuations and less pressure from creditors. Global competition continued to grow. China's policy of diversifying supplies became systematic. Even if tariffs were abolished, buyers would no longer be in a hurry to return to their previous dependence on the US. The loss of trust was too costly. Therefore, the future of American soybeans was increasingly linked to a hybrid model. Some are exported, but a significant share is processed and sold domestically. This was the turning point that many considered a quiet revolution. American soybeans ceased to be exclusively an export commodity and began to seek new roles, from fuel to organic food. This process was difficult and painful, but it was precisely this that opened up the possibility of survival in conditions where the global trade map was changing faster than the beans were ripening in the fields.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States, and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
This is how two paths converged: the external one, where competition and logistics decided everything, and the internal one, where diversification opened up opportunities. And although neither of them promised instant profits, together they created the foundation for a new future. Farmers could no longer rely solely on ocean-going ships. Their survival depended on how well they could integrate into new chains, both local and global, and how quickly they could understand that it was not those who grew more who would win, but those who could sell smarter. American agriculture has always lived in balance between nature and the market, but recent years have shown that this balance is no longer enough. When farmers faced falling exports and pressure from creditors, it became clear that survival requires not only productivity, but also systematic risk management, innovation, and new sustainability. Whereas in the past it was possible to rely on tradition and luck, now the focus is on accurate data, technology, and the ability to adapt to the most drastic changes. Farmers who used to work by eye began to understand that without taking into account cost, field analysis, and planning, every dollar becomes a risk. The introduction of technology is no longer a luxury, but a matter of survival. Drones, satellite imagery, precision farming systems, smart soil moisture sensors, all of these have gradually found their way into farms. According to reliable data, about 40% of large producers in the US already use drones to monitor their fields, and according to fictional but realistic forecasts, another 25% of small farmers have begun to form groups and rent equipment together to reduce costs. This changed the very culture of work, from random decisions to mathematics,